Just my enemies. That's all.
The Godfather Part II wasn't born from calm meetings. It clawed its way through chaos, defiance, and exhaustion. Every quiet frame hides a battlefield of egos, rewrites, and impossible standards. Behind its elegance was fire. Tonight we uncover 20 shocking secrets buried inside Coppola's masterpiece, each revealing how perfection nearly collapsed and stay until the end. The bonus fact will change how you see the Corleones forever, insults. Pacino nearly walked away. Al Pacino almost refused to return as Michael Corleone. After the first film's brutal schedule, he was drained and unimpressed with Coppola's early draft. He called it unfinished and hollow. Paramount panicked. Without Pacino, there was no sequel. Meetings turned tense. Agents circled like sharks. Coppola spent one frantic night rewriting pages to deepen Michael's emotional descent. The next morning, Pacino read them and relented, but only after demanding complete creative respect. That single confrontation defined the film's soul. His Michael became colder, quieter, dead behind the eyes, a man consumed by the cost of control. It wasn't vanity. It was an artist protecting truth. Pacino's demand for meaning over money forced Coppola to dig deeper, to turn gangster spectacle into Greek tragedy. When the cameras rolled, his performance carried that war within him. What audiences see as effortless calm is really a man barely holding the world together on screen and off. Coppola's power play for control. Francis Ford Coppola had no intention of returning to direct. Paramount wanted another hit. Coppola wanted peace. After constant clashes during the first Godfather, he told them he'd only do it under impossible terms: total creative freedom, final cut, and the right to call it Part 2. Studio heads balked. No film had ever carried a numbered title, but Coppola held the winning hand. The first movie had made millions, and only he could deliver its successor. So the studio caved. That small victory changed Hollywood forever, legitimizing sequels as prestige art instead of cheap follow-ups. Yet control came with isolation. Coppola later said he felt under siege, daily budget arguments, casting threats, endless memos. Still, that defiance gave birth to something larger than a sequel, a mirror image of American power reflecting corruption from both sides of the camera. It wasn't ego, it was survival, the price of steering a masterpiece through enemy territory. A sequel and a prequel in one gamble. Coppola's boldest idea split the story in half. One timeline followed Michael's moral collapse in the 1950s. The other traced young Vito Corleone's rise decades earlier. Executives were horrified. Two narratives? Two actors as one character? They feared confusion and financial disaster. Even editors doubted it would cut together. But Coppola saw rhythm instead of risk, a visual echo where every crime in one era reverberated in the other. Audiences didn't just watch power shift, they felt time folding in on itself. The gamble nearly collapsed during early screenings when viewers couldn't track the transitions. Weeks of re-editing fixed pacing and tone until the dual structure became seamless. It wasn't innovation for novelty's sake. It was Coppola's way of showing that every empire, whether a family or a nation, rises and rots by the same rules. The prequel-sequel design turned cinema into symphony, each note of ambition answering the other in tragedy. The Clemenza feud that changed the script. Richard Castellano, beloved as Clemenza, wanted back in but on his terms. He demanded higher pay and the right to rewrite his dialogue. Coppola refused. The studio panicked. Their standoff grew ugly, with threats of lawsuits and gossip leaking to the press. Finally, Coppola cut Clemenza from the story entirely. Instead, he invented Frank Pentangeli, the weary soldier who testifies before the Senate. The rewrite changed everything. Pentangeli's betrayal added vulnerability and tragedy missing from Clemenza's arc, giving the sequel its emotional midsection. What began as a contract dispute turned into storytelling genius. Coppola later admitted it hurt to lose Castellano, but the new character allowed fresh themes of loyalty and regret. It wasn't simply recasting, it was creative alchemy under fire. Out of frustration came one of the most haunting figures in the saga, reminding audiences that in the Corleone world, loyalty dies louder than bullets. Robert De Niro's silent mastery. Before fame, Robert De Niro auditioned for Sonny in the first film and lost. 2 years later, Coppola called him back this time to play young Vito Corleone. De Niro vanished to Sicily for months, living among villagers, recording their accents, and learning the dialect until he could improvise fluently. 90% of his dialogue in the finished film isn't English. Paramount executives worried audiences wouldn't read subtitles, but Coppola stood firm. De Niro's restraint and authenticity became hypnotic. His eyes carried the story. He didn't mimic Brando, he rebuilt him from youth. On set, crew members said De Niro barely spoke out of character. His dedication paid off. He won the Oscar for a role mostly spoken in Sicilian, one of the quietest yet loudest performances in history. It wasn't method for glory, it was devotion to truth. De Niro turned language into emotion and silence into legacy. The locations that lied beautifully. Those bustling New York immigrant streets weren't shot in America at all. Tight budgets and modern skylines made it impossible to recreate early 1900s Manhattan, so Coppola's team found a solution in Trieste, Italy. They transformed its docks into Ellis Island with smoke machines, wooden cranes, and hundreds of locals as extras. Children shivered in thin coats while steamships groaned in artificial fog. The illusion was so convincing that many believed it was real archival footage. Yet behind the camera, crew battled freezing winds, seasickness, and collapsing sets built overnight. The authenticity you see on screen is an act of deception held together by exhaustion. Coppola once joked they spent as much time repairing costumes as filming them. It wasn't convenience, it was desperation turned art. Those Trieste streets proved that cinema's most convincing lies are the ones born from limitation and belief. Cost overruns that nearly sank it. The film began with a lean $6 million budget, half the first movie's earnings, but the dream doubled in size before long. Period sets, dual timelines, overseas shoots, and endless retakes sent expenses spiraling toward $13 million. Paramount's patience cracked. Studio executives flew to locations unannounced, shouting about schedules while Coppola rewrote scenes midday. The crew called them the money police. Tension grew so thick some department heads threatened to quit. Coppola mortgaged part of his own property to cover overruns, yet the excess bought timelessness. Cuba, Tahoe, and Sicily rendered with operatic grandeur. Every dollar felt like a plea for immortality. When the final product earned more than triple its cost, the gamble vindicated him completely. It wasn't reckless spending. It was stubborn faith that art deserves room to breathe. Without those millions at risk, there would be no masterpiece, only a safe sequel fading into history. When Coppola hid under his bed. After months of editing, Coppola screened an early cut for test audiences. The response was brutal. Viewers fidgeted, complained it was too slow, too confusing, too dark. Convinced his career was over, Coppola returned to his apartment and, by his own admission, hid under the bed, waiting for the studio's angry call. But the call never came. Instead, he regrouped, trimmed 40 minutes, and rearranged entire sequences. When the re-edited version premiered, critics hailed it as a revelation. The same film that once caused despair won 6 Oscars. Coppola often said fear sharpened his instincts. He learned that terror can guide genius if you don't let it break you. It wasn't cowardice. It was metamorphosis under pressure. The director who hid in shame rose days later with a classic that no longer belonged to the studio, or even himself, it belonged to cinema history. The real history inside the fiction. The film's Havana subplot wasn't invented. It mirrored the final days of Batista's Cuba. Coppola studied photographs and embassy reports to recreate the New Year's Eve chaos that preceded the revolution. The golden telephone gifted to dictator Batista actually existed, symbolizing American influence over Cuban elites. By weaving it into Hyman Roth's storyline, Coppola blurred history and myth until they were indistinguishable. When extras danced during the party scene, soldiers outside the set were genuine Cuban expatriates, men who'd lived through those very nights. The realism made the fiction ache with truth. Audiences thought it was imagination. Historians recognized documentation in disguise. The Godfather Part 1 and 2 wasn't about crime syndicates anymore. It was about empires falling while the rich toasted champagne. It wasn't art imitating life, it was life, replayed under the golden light of tragedy. The film that redefined sequels. Go ahead and like and subscribe, because this single fact changed everything you watch today. Before Part 2, sequels were cheap echoes of success. After Part 2, they became continuity, mythology, prestige. Coppola's insistence on the numeral wasn't marketing, it was defiance. He wanted audiences to treat the story as one continuous legacy, not a cash grab. Studios resisted. They feared confusion. But when critics declared it superior to the original, Hollywood's rules collapsed overnight. Franchises, sagas, trilogies all traced their legitimacy to this decision. Coppola proved that a sequel could deepen rather than dilute, expand rather than exploit. It wasn't follow-up filmmaking, it was narrative architecture spanning generations. Every cinematic universe that exists today owes a quiet debt to that stubborn Roman numeral etched into title cards half a century ago. Improvised moments that stayed forever. Improvisation built much of Part 2's soul. One afternoon in Sicily, an elderly extra unexpectedly greeted young Vito with a blessing in dialect. De Niro responded instinctively. Coppola loved the warmth and left it untouched. Similar sparks happened with Pacino, who often reshaped silence into power, like pausing before closing the door on Kay. That single breath turned a line into heartbreak. None of it existed on paper. The crew learned to keep cameras rolling long after cut, knowing genius hid in the accidents. On this film, mistakes were miracles. It wasn't rebellion against structure, it was surrender to truth. Those unscripted glances, hesitations, and smiles carried humanity into an operatic world of betrayal. The irony? Every spontaneous moment required endless preparation. When art and accident collided, The Godfather Part The Sing found its heartbeat. The real Lake Tahoe estate? Michael Corleone's mansion wasn't a soundstage illusion, it was a genuine estate perched on Lake Tahoe's edge. The family that owned it rented the property for months, watching their quiet retreat turn into cinematic legend. Crew drilled holes through floors for camera rigs, flooded rooms with heavy arc lights, and battled freezing winds off the water. Even the lake's reflection caused exposure nightmares, forcing entire night scenes to be reshot. Yet that realness mattered. Its cold vastness mirrored Michael's isolation. When he sits alone in that chair overlooking the lake, you can almost feel the damp chill seeping from the set itself. The house aged after filming, but tourists still whisper it feels haunted by regret. It wasn't decoration. It was character, the lake, the fog, and those echoing hallways silently judging the last Corleone. The birth of Part 2 sequels. No major studio film had ever dared put a numeral in its title. Paramount executives hated the idea, calling it confusing and pretentious. Coppola argued it was the only honest way to show continuity. The fight dragged for weeks until he threatened to quit. Paramount relented and changed Hollywood forever. The success of The Godfather Part The Sue made sequels respectable, birthing Rocky Sekingun, Superman the Seku, and every numbered franchise since. The label told audiences this was more than repetition, it was evolution. Critics who once dismissed sequels as leftovers began calling them sagas. The title became a promise that stories could grow, families could fall, and history could loop back on itself. It wasn't a stylistic quirk, it was a revolution in branding and narrative continuity. That tiny Roman numeral turned a follow-up into a dynasty. John Cazale's fragile genius. John Cazale's portrayal of Fredo remains one of cinema's quiet heartbreaks. Off-screen, Cazale was gentle and self-critical, rehearsing endlessly to find the truth behind weakness. On set, Pacino treated him like a brother. Their emotional bond bled into the story. During the "You Broke My Heart" scene, Pacino avoided eye contact until cameras rolled, preserving raw tension. The tears you see aren't planned, they're eruption. Cazale captured the ache of betrayal without grand gestures, only trembling honesty. He once said, "Fredo just wants to be loved," and that understanding rewrote the character from fool to fallen son. Coppola later admitted that Cazale's quiet intensity held the entire midsection together. It wasn't melodrama, it was vulnerability. Weaponized a reminder that tragedy often wears the face of family. The Dominican Republic masquerade. The opulent Havana sequences weren't filmed in Cuba at all. Political restrictions made it impossible. Paramount's parent company happened to own hotels and land in the Dominican Republic, so they transformed Santo Domingo into 1950s Havana. Crews painted facades, imported vintage Chevrolets, and choreographed hundreds of extras to the rhythm of real Cuban bands. The humidity was merciless, makeup melted, film stock warped, and extras fainted under the lights. Yet the illusion worked. On screen, it feels lush and corrupt, decadent yet doomed. Locals still recall nights when explosions from staged riots rattled the streets. It wasn't glamour, it was grit disguised as luxury. Through sweat and improvisation, Coppola captured the fever of a nation on the brink, proving that location is less about geography than atmosphere. The immigrant parable beneath the crime, beneath bullets and betrayal lies the story Coppola truly wanted to tell, America itself. Young Vito's climb from helpless orphan to powerful patriarch mirrors the immigrant dream ambition turning to empire. By contrast, Michael's descent reveals that success devours its own children. Coppola called it the story of capitalism in Italian clothing. Every decision, lighting, costume, language serves that metaphor. The sepia tones of Vito's world evoke nostalgia. The icy blues of Michael's world evoke moral frostbite. It wasn't a gangster saga, it was a mirror to the American soul, asking how far people will go to protect what they built. The tragedy isn't crime, it's assimilation's cost. That dual narrative transformed the Corleone family from mobsters into myth, echoing long after the credits. The overnight rewrite that saved the shoot. The film almost collapsed before day one. Hours before cameras rolled, Pacino threatened to quit again, unhappy with Michael's courtroom scenes. Coppola locked himself in a hotel suite with typewriters, coffee, and panic. By dawn, he'd rewritten entire sections, deepening Michael's paranoia and cold authority. The next morning, Pacino read the pages, nodded once, and returned to set. Those emergency rewrites became the film's backbone, giving Michael sharper edges and haunting silences. Crew members still remember Coppola emerging sleepless, holding fresh pages with trembling hands. It wasn't inspiration, it was desperation sculpting genius. Without that single night of madness, Michael Corleone might have walked away, and cinema would have lost its most chilling monarch. Editing nightmares and salvation in the cut. 6 editors battled hundreds of hours of footage. The dual timelines baffled everyone's scenes that worked alone collapsed when intercut. Some begged Coppola to pick one era and scrap the other. He refused. For months, they rearranged reels in a dark New York editing suite until emotional rhythm replaced chronology. One night, an assistant spliced the wrong reel. Suddenly, a transition from young Vito to old Michael felt poetic. Coppola saw it and said, "That's it." Accident became architecture. The final pattern, rise and fall intertwined, emerged through exhaustion, not plan. It wasn't clean craftsmanship, it was discovery in chaos. The editors later joked they didn't finish the film, it surrendered itself when they stopped fighting it. The cultural earthquake that followed. When The Godfather Part II premiered, critics were cautious then stunned. Within weeks, headlines called it the rare sequel that eclipses the original. Universities dissected it as modern tragedy. Politicians quoted its lines in speeches. Even real mob figures adopted its tone and etiquette, blurring cinema and life. Suddenly, being a Corleone meant gravitas, not criminality. The film's influence reached writers, composers, and historians. It redefined narrative gravity. Awards poured in, but the true victories, transformation. Hollywood realized that intelligence could sell. It wasn't popularity chasing prestige. It was prestige dragging the masses with it. From that moment, every serious filmmaker owed a debt to the Corleone legacy. The real figures behind the fiction. Hyman Roth wasn't pure invention, he was Meyer Lansky in thin disguise. The parallels were exact: a frail businessman, global casinos, exile in Israel. When the movie released, journalists cornered Lansky outside a Miami Beach hotel. His reply, "They stole my story." He reportedly considered suing, then dropped it. Coppola never confirmed the link, but insiders knew. The blurred boundary between fact and fiction gave the film unsettling realism. Audiences watched dramatization, historians saw reenactment. That friction made Part 2 feel dangerous, as if revealing secrets never meant to surface. It wasn't imitation, it was reflection, the underworld, staring back at its own portrait and recognizing itself. Bonus fact: the zipper disaster. Mid-shoot, costume designers proudly presented dozens of period suits for De Niro's early 1900s scenes. Coppola examined one jacket, frowned, and unzipped it literally. Zippers hadn't yet been invented. Production halted for 2 days while every outfit was rebuilt with button fastenings. The oversight cost thousands, but preserved authenticity. Coppola laughed later, calling it our most expensive history lesson. It wasn't perfectionism, it was reverence for detail. Even the smallest inaccuracy, he believed, could pull audiences out of the illusion. The buttons stayed, the legend grew. Half a century later, The Godfather Part di Sadu remains Hollywood's holy text of ambition and consequence. Every triumph hid turmoil, every elegant shot was paid for in panic and genius. What began as chaos became cinematic scripture. If these revelations changed how you see the Corleones, hit like, subscribe, and join us for more secrets buried behind the silver screen. Because in Hollywood, power fades, but stories like family legacies never truly die.